are not so crash hot. This one actually proved to be not so crash hot. Wave drag is a tricky one. There's not too many ways we can really deal with it. As I mentioned, potentially body shape. That's why if you've ever seen these big tankers with the big nose things sticking out the front, that's what that's for, is to reduce wave drag. They're kind of creating a second wave system out in front of the hull of the boat, which can cancel out the main wave that's being created by the bow through here. So again, it gets a bit complicated, but there are ways to deal with it. But for us, really, we're looking at depth is going to be the big one. So this is where I was talking before, where the area right through here, so that red line there is roughly the amount of drag, okay? So you can see if you're, so in this case, it's talking about thicknesses. So if you go to like a chest depth, okay? So if you're half a chest depth below the surface, or essentially just submerged, that's where drag's maximum. And then you need to get down to almost 3 kind of body thicknesses until you get away from that. So this has a pretty big influence on underwater kicking trajectories. The big rider, and that's why I have the little asterisk there, is based on the skill of the athlete and how good they are underwater. All right. If you have an athlete that's not that good a kicker, or they can kind of just barely kick as fast as they can swim, it's probably not worth it having them stay down for that long. You know, obviously you want to come off the wall and get through that initial bit of turbulence and whatnot, but to stay down, if they're not actually a good kicker, is pretty much going to be a waste of time, okay? And largely because it's wasting energy to move slower than you could be if you were on the surface. There's a bit of optimization on that, but as a general rule, that's the case. So in case I didn't push that before, body position is our #1 thing. So that's really where you need to be focusing as much as possible. Because if you get into a position like that, better streamline, reducing that area of turbulent water behind so you get lower drag. So everything else being the same, legs down, you're going to have a big area back here, more frontal area exposed, so you're going to get that higher drag. So really, really push that body position. Propulsion on the other side is basically just kind of the reverse. Like I told Damon, you can't have any kind of biomechanics talk without an equation. Basically, that's just, I'm just kind of being a bit of a dick, really. But essentially, that just kind of shows you how it actually works. So you do have, there's a drag component, and this is where it can get quite confusing when you read some of this stuff. You're talking about a propulsive force that's got a drag component and a lift component, okay? What it really should probably be, just to, and then you have drag force in general. But what we should probably, when we're talking about propulsion, we probably should call that, I don't know, front to back or something, that just to kind of differentiate it a little bit. Because really, that drag component, which is defined by that, and that's actually, may look kind of scary, but it's not that bad really. So just so you know, in case, because you will probably run across that equation somewhere in reading something about swimming propulsion. So half is pretty self-explanatory. That guy there, rho, is the density of the water, which again is just, it's a constant based on what the temperature of the water is, so it's pretty stable. V is just the velocity squared. So that can be, depending what you're looking at. So that can be, if you're looking at propulsive force at the hand, that's going to be what's the velocity of the hand. If it's whole body kind of propulsion, what total propulsion you're generating, it's going to be the velocity of the center of mass. A is the cross-sectional area we were talking about before. And then that CD is the coefficient of drag, okay, which is just another constant that you work out for a given position, largely for, in this case, for the hand. And then basically the equation is exactly the same for lift, which again is just, so if I'm pulling that way, so I'm pushing on, if I pull straight back, That's just total drag force, right? All the force is kind of front to back, right? If I start pitching my hand and coming in on angles, there's actually a component of that force that's going side to side. That's lift, okay? So you got front to back and side to side. That's drag and lift. Okay? So that's the only difference really in those equations is just those different coefficients for lift, okay? So don't get too freaked out by when you do see those equations. They're pretty relatively speaking somewhat simple. So what we do look for though is that to hold a constant velocity, that real drag force needs to be equal to the propulsive force that you generate. And when those are balanced, then you're going to have a constant velocity. As soon as the drag force is higher than that propulsive force, you slow down, and propulsive force higher than drag, you're going to speed up. So we hit those points all the way through a stroke, right? So your velocity is changing all the time, which isn't actually all that efficient. So this is the reason things aren't that efficient. Okay, remember, so Newton's second law is the acceleration is proportional to the force and the mass, right? So if you are accelerating, so that's either positively going faster or negatively slowing down, there's got to be an additional force applied. Okay, so if you're swimming through your stroke and you've got big swings in your velocity, okay, this is more of a concern as you're speeding back up. So if you have a big drop off, so even say in breaststroke, right, where that if you look at velocity in the kind of the right in the middle of the recovery, that velocity doesn't hit zero, but it can get pretty bloody close. So to maintain that, to get back to that average swimming speed, we have to accelerate. Okay, how do we accelerate? You apply an extra force. So then you've got to accelerate to get back up. So the bigger that drop off in velocity is, you've still got a constrained amount of time. So you've still got to get yourself from that slow velocity up to your free swim velocity. So if that's a big change, your acceleration's got to be higher, you've got to have a bigger force. So if that's in freestyle, any of the strokes. So the tighter you can keep that peak to trough within a stroke cycle, you're actually going to be more efficient because things are going to stay in balance, and you'll only have to be doing just the force, relatively, to overcome drag, and you're not going to have to be doing that extra force that you need to accelerate yourself over and above what you already did. Does that make sense? Hopefully. Because it's actually pretty important, and that's why one of the things we're working on ways to get at this a bit more effectively is what is that actual fluctuation in speed throughout a stroke. Because you do see more skilled athletes, that fluctuation from fastest to slowest within a stroke cycle is going to be a whole lot tighter, much more, in all the strokes. Oops. Then, so for the third law, it's action-reaction. So the action-reaction thing is actually, a lot of people have a lot of problems with this conceptually. The fundamental thing, so if you look at it from this point of view, I'm standing here, so I'm pretty much pushing down on, pretend I'm on the ground. So I'm pushing on the ground, so that's my action, right? The reaction for that is the earth is pushing back up on me, okay? That's actually the force we're worried about. Not so much the force I'm pushing down, but what am I getting back? If that force wasn't coming back onto me, I would just collapse, right? So same kind of thing when we start talking at propulsion. We're not really worried about what's the force that we're applying, really. We're worried about what's the reaction force that we get back from the water. So when we start looking at, say, with kick in this situation, when you get into there, so on the downbeat of the kick with good ankle flexibility, actually pushing back on the water. So what's going to be the reaction to that? Water pushing back on the athlete. So that's when you get a good propulsive kick. You get that situation, the kind of typical triathlete kick, where if you've never seen them go backwards, they do. It does happen. And a lot of it is, it's ankle flexibility and body position in general, but they'll actually, when they kind of hook hook, that downbeat, the force they're applying is actually, their applied force is moving towards the head. So the reaction force to that is going the other way. So it's actually tending to slow them down, which is why they tend to move backwards. Okay? It's entertaining if you ever see it. But. All right, so we do have a few things that we try to use to maximize some of this propulsion in particular, and a lot of it is going to rely around the catch, so that you are able to maximize the force. You're going to maximize the mass of water that you're in contact with, that you're trying to accelerate to get a reaction force. Okay? So again, if I haven't hit that enough, good body alignment is always going to help. Because remember, the human body is not designed to swim, okay? Particularly the shoulders. They're really, shoulders are really designed to exert force from here down, okay? When we're up here, the shoulder is designed to reach. That's what it's there for, okay? Not designed to generate force. So we've got to have good alignment or optimize our alignment so that we can get good force production without causing injury, okay? So that's where that kind of comes in. So we want good alignment, we want a good streamline extension, again, keeping good body length. Remember, that helps with drag reduction as well. Initiating from the shoulder, not the wrist. This is, again, remember we talked about the sequencing. When you're trying to maximize velocity at an endpoint out here, you're going to start with the trunk through the shoulder, upper arm. So that's where the anchor has got to happen up here, not at the wrist first. Ideally, this high elbow orientation, again, I'll talk about that. So, talking about the high elbow catch, which is kind of the standard, has been for quite a while. And then maintaining connection through timing and then core strength. So this is where you want to have that, again, having that good strong base that you can work off of. And symmetrical. This is another biggie, largely across all sports or across all strokes. But we want to try to be as even side to side as we can. Fundamentally, that comes back to that constant velocity idea. Okay, if you have one side that's stronger than the other, you're going to tend to have a big speed up, slow down within your stroke that's bigger than it could be if you were more balanced. All right, so you want to make sure the actions that you're doing are symmetrical so that the forces are the same, so the accelerations are the same, and you got a better shot at maintaining closer to a consistent velocity. And then you got width of the catch. Actually, I'll talk about that in a second. So when we talk about the high elbow kind of a catch, so that's your kind of classical kind of position there as opposed to that. I think in some ways this can get pushed almost a little bit too hard at times. Remember, we're not designed for force up here, right? We're also really not designed. So essentially when you get in that position, to get a high elbow, you have to what's called internally rotate your shoulder, right? So you're going to be essentially rolling your thumb in to get the elbow up. And then, I don't know if you guys have done abduction, adduction. You done all that kind of stuff? Anyway, if you're trying to move your arm away from the center line of your body, that's called abduction, okay? And if you're adding your arm to the body, adding to the mass, that's adduction, okay? Little kinesiology question for you. So our shoulders are not designed to do abduction, abduction, and internal rotation, which is what we're asking you to do when you do a high elbow catch. So people that are really good at having a serious high elbow catch, you look at Hackett's, Thorpe, those kind of guys, and you see them and they'll go out into extension through here, and then they do that, okay? The amount of people that can actually do that effectively is very, very, very small. So trying to get, especially younger kids, to do that, you're asking for shoulder problems, okay? Because what happens, if the shoulder's not structured, and you almost can't change this because it's structural issues within the joint. So those guys can get away with it. That's just the way they're built. So that's genetics for you. But what we want to try to do with the younger kids is get them to at least go towards this. So the way I usually describe it is when you're looking right around that catch position, draw a line between the shoulder and the wrist, okay? And the elbow should be at least on that line or slightly above it, okay? If it's below the line, that's more of a problem. And because when you're talking that or that, you're still okay. You're not going to be doing much damage. But you look at the difference in position that can then entail particularly with the hand. Now we're talking about the direction forces are applied. You get the high elbow, you're going to start getting the hand into an orientation where it's going to pull back on the water. Drop the elbow, the hand tends to flick up, and you're actually pushing just like the triathlete kicking, okay? Pushing it the other way against the water. The other advantage too, remember one of the big things that when we talk about force application is that surface area. Remember the little equation, cross-sectional area? So when you start getting that high elbow, you actually start utilizing the forearm a bit more. How much of the forearm we're actually using is debatable as well. In theory, once you get into the main part of the in-sweep in particular, you will actually start using some of the upper arm, but again, we don't really know the exact contributions of that. So fundamentally, try to get them close to that, and you can think about that with the other strokes too. Those kinds of, anytime you're calling for a high elbow position, just try to think about that orientation, and remember, we got to try to look after shoulders. If they can do it, as they get a bit stronger, as they're developing, and you see that they can do that, no problems, that's great, good for them. But don't try to make every kid doing a Hackett, because you're just going to trash them. Again, for the kick, similar kinds of things. So you'll see it's basically almost the same as with the catch. Good body alignment, initiated from up here, from the bigger segments, not down from the knees or the ankles. Flexible ankles are obviously a benefit, like we saw in that kick slide before. If you have good flexible ankles, you can get the top of the foot pushing back on the water without a lot of knee bend. So again, you're pushing back without sacrificing extra drag from dropping the knees down to get that position. And then again, the timing, and again, symmetrical, okay? A lot of this stuff too, is really just kind of reiterating the big issues. So for flutter kick, obviously the ankles are a big thing. You can improve that a bit, so it is worth working on kids with getting their ankle flexibility better. It is a hard one to change, but it can be, every little bit can be beneficial. So the consequence, like I just said before, if you do have poor flexibilities, you end up, so if they can't, let me see these shoes on, I can't do anything, but so assume my foot was pointing back. So if I had good pointed toes, I could be like that. But if I don't have good ankle flexibility, and I'm only like that, I got to do that, roughly, to actually get that foot into a good position to kick. So that's why if you don't have it, you're going to get that knee bend, and that's going to cascade. Your hips are going to drop down. Everything just kind of turns into more of a cycling motion. And that's a big one too, between both of these types of kicking. It's got to be at two directions. Okay, it's way too often that we see everybody's really good, strong downbeat kick, but then just kind of floating back up or little flicks and things like that. You obviously have to modulate that a bit depending on the distance that you're going. 1,500 guys are not going to be doing the massive upbeats, but especially when you start talking the sprints, it's really got to be two-way. And it, not only for flutter, but especially for dolphin. Because there's a lot of power that you can use, especially for dolphin, just because of the way the movement works. You start utilizing some quite big muscles through your core. So it really, rather, if you see the kids that are dolphining just from the hip, it should be starting up here, just below the chest. Okay, that's kind of your main base hinge in a dolphin kick. So one thing you can look for that they're not being kind of symmetrical is if you watch the kick and at the end of the downbeat, their hips kind of pop up, okay? That's a sign that they're not initiating that back upbeat effectively. So if you watch somebody, because if you do a downbeat, really to get power out of it, you've actually got to start that return to get a whip on the end. So if you're not initiating that return early, you get that, and then they'll do this. So rather than down, I did that wrong. So there is you're starting the return, just take my word for it, because I can't do it while I'm standing on the thing. But so that is a good little sign. Just look for any kind of real big pops in the hips. It should be a nice continuous motion. So those are just some more examples of things, what we were talking about. So you get that kind of more sprint type technique there. A little bit straighter. That's actually the shocker we want to avoid at all costs. That's another tricky one too. That's starting to get a bit too close. The problem with that is, remember that we have a big influence on the water around the body, okay? So you're actually playing with water flow all around you. So if you start pushing with your hand into here, you're actually going to start pushing against water that's already been made a bit turbulent. So it's already got some motion into it. So when you apply a force, you're not going to get as big a reaction from it. So having that bit of extra depth, you get into roughly more still water. So you can actually get a bigger reaction force from it. Obviously, the problem is the further away from that you get, you put more load on the shoulder. So that's why we kind of try to optimize that a little bit. So putting that, classically around 90 to 100 degree angle through there, maybe a little bit bigger if you're sprinting, and a little bit closer probably if you're distance. When we start looking, so that's kind of the Hackett thing I was talking about before. If you can do that, good on you. But again, with the younger kids, don't shoot for that too early, because it can do more damage than good. The other thing is pull width, and that's where we get into more of the torque thing. Remember we were talking about when you apply to balance with center of mass and center of buoyancy, when everything kind of aligns, because you get a torque from the center of buoyancy around the center of mass. So same thing applies here. You got center of mass here. You're applying a force from that hand. Where is that force, that line of that force that you're applying relative to the center of mass? Out here, right? So imagine a rowboat with one oar, okay? You pull wide, what tends to happen? Go around in circles, right? Same kind of thing. You start doing too much of this, you're going to end up doing this kind of stuff, getting this whole snake thing going, okay? Sometimes you'll get that, slight variations of this. It's also a weaker position if you get out here. You're not actually able to have everything align more properly and use the bigger muscles of the upper trunk to exert that force. So having it more, just inside the shoulder to midline, kind of in that, that classical area. There is kind of a reason for that. We do want to try to minimize this action-reaction that you get here, because that snaking motion that you will see, obviously, is a real problem, because it causes a lot of extra force on the body. Okay, I'm running out of time, so I'm going to skip through some of this. So this was just kind of going through the 4 strokes. Same kind of thing. That footage there. Again, just looking at body position, nice and still, nice stable head, keeping everything moving, nice clean rotation around that one axis. And then, so this is the backstroke corollary, really, of the freestyle. Same kind of a thing. If you can do that kind of a catch and backstroke, that's fantastic. But do watch it, because you will put a big stretch through that anterior part of the shoulder. Butterfly as well is another one. And again, butterfly breaststroke really for me is about maintaining that body position and trying to minimize the amount of drag. Those short axis strokes tend to have a bit more drag just due to the nature of how they are. So trying to Again, keep that velocity as consistent as possible. One of the big things with that is how high you come up on the breath versus when you're not breathing, okay? One thing to watch, especially if you have underwater footage of an athlete, when you're watching them swing from the side, really, you shouldn't be able to tell if they're gonna breathe or not until just at the very last second, okay? What you see far too often is you'll get kids that swimming along, not breathing, and as soon as they're gonna breathe, they'll do that. So they'll pick up their head right at the bottom of the dolphin up front. So you're a lot of frontal area, reaction to that, hips are gonna tend to drop. So you again get this cascade thing. Whereas if you're doing it properly, swimming along on the breath, it's just gonna be a chin forward. And that's what you kind of will see with a lot of these guys. Chins are stay very low. And if you look at it, this isn't the best image, but it kind of got somewhat the point across. So a breathing and a non-breathing stroke for there. You can't really tell in that slide, but, and then also the, again, higher elbow positions. That's again quite weaker. That position there really should be towards the back. So you're trying to keep your paddle big and pushing back. Having a big paddle and pushing up on the water doesn't do you anything, just pushes your hips down. So remember, you got to think about what you're using as a paddle, what direction does the force have to be directed, and how are you going to get the body to do that. Breaststroke, same kind of thing. It's all timing. Everybody knows that, hopefully. Again, head positions, keeping that orientation as clean as you can and as consistent as you can. Not a lot of up and down. Usually when you see the big up and down from the head, that's usually a good sign of fatigue. I don't know if you'll actually see this or not. So this was actually quite a nice little clip if you watch it slow. If you watch his kick, that cuts it off. But it's a very direct, it's much more direct back than what you would think. It is kind of like, where is he? Like that. So it's definitely pushing back on the water. It's not quite as whippy. And because you're having that much higher contribution of the drag component of the force. Problem with the breaststroke kick, obviously, is that it is largely a born skill. It's really hard to change people to get them, because it's so much of it structural. How your hips and your shanks are actually built. If you look at somebody like Liesel, she was actually almost not knock-kneed, but if you look at the angle through her legs, the way she was built was perfect for a breaststroke kick. She was already halfway there, just in how she stands. Tibial torsions, how much twist you actually have through your tibia, flexibility, adductors, and then the timing. Again, remember, we're looking at trying to minimize that fluctuation from peak to trough in breaststroke, so that's why that timing is always quite critical. And I think now you're pretty much seeing it pretty consistently. The best breaststrokers, the way the timing that they use is that the main drive from the kick happens just as the arms are hitting out into full extension. Okay? It's not there and then kick. It's much more closely not simultaneous, but it's a bit more tightly timed. Starts, turns are really all about the action-reaction stuff. So you're getting the body into a position where you're going to maximize the force, getting that impulse right so the time is right as well. So I'll just kind of skip through this. So I'm basically out of time myself. So this, just so in case you haven't seen, this is the wet plate analysis that we'll do at AIS, and they do something similar at QAS now as well, where we measure all the forces acting on the block, rear foot, and then horizontal, vertical force. Green is grab force, and we get speed and things from that. So we can get a pretty good idea of what's going on, so we want to get a good big force curve, shorter period of time, so we get a big impulse, which gives us a big change in velocity. And then again, we spend a fair bit of time looking at body positions and how they're directing that force. Same thing with turns. Again, this was always a good one too. what you will often get in kids, and I see this all the time, especially the kids that are in big programs and they're doing quite, busy lane circle swimming. Ideally, you want to get into that kind of a position if you're looking from the bottom. So you look at where the force is as you push off the wall, nice clean right through the center of mass is going to be about there. So that force is nice and straight, directed down the pool, you're maximizing it. As soon as you start doing circle swimming, what happens is that hip angle opens up, shoulders are back up here, so as they push off, that's how they get the ability to circle swim. And that does actually reduce how much is going down the pool, and then it's a habit that they get, so when they race, they'll start doing it as well. So their turns aren't as effective, and they're wasting time and speed. And then I won't get into that one as well. Right, so sorry, Damo, a bit over. So anybody got any real quick questions about any of that? I know trying to cover that kind of a topic in an hour is tricky, but.
All right, hey, on behalf of everyone, thank you. Technical subject, we explained it so even coaches can understand. Thank you very much. Well done.
No problem. Okay. Yeah, good.
He's obviously got a good sense of humour. Like, I found him quite amusing.
He's got a drop. All right, everybody, if you'd like to make your way to a seat. Couple of things this morning. We are live streaming out of this conference today. So just be careful of inappropriate language, please. It'll go around the world. Through the SwimPro website, there's a whole heap of American coaches watching in here, and I suppose part of ASCTA's vision for the future is we hope in 5 or 10 years' time that there might be 700 or 800 coaches in the room and 7,000 or 8,000 out there also pay-per-view watching. Similar to what we see with live sport. It gives me great pleasure now to introduce Damien Farrow. Damien is a jointly appointed Professor of Skill Acquisition with Victoria University and the AIS. He's responsible for the provision of evidence-based scientific support for coaches seeking to develop their skills for their athletes. He has extensive applied science exercise experience working with a range of NSOs, National Sporting Organisations for those coaches in the room, including Swimming Australia, Netball Australia, Cricket Australia, Tennis Australia, the AFL and numerous clubs. So across to Damien. Thank you.
Wait for this, I gather. Great. Well, I don't know swimming super well. I'm relatively new to the sport relative to many of you, I'm sure, but I do know who Forbes Carlisle is, and I know he was renowned for being an innovative coach using science to improve the training methods of his athletes way back from the 40s onwards. So that's quite fitting because hopefully today I'm going to challenge some of your training methods as we apply it to skill and the acquisition of skill. And I'm going to start by introducing you to another big kahuna. So Forbes is obviously a big kahuna in swimming. And this guy, Tom Embry, well, he's a self-anointed big kahuna in basketball free throwing. And if we go back to 1993, November 21st, he set the Guinness Book of Records for the most consecutive free throws in a row without a miss. 2,750 in a row. Whoop, gone the wrong way. So I'll just show you a little bit of Tom in action. Gets a bit monotonous, as you might expect, 2,750 without a miss. The only reason he stopped at 2,750 was that he only had the gym booked for 12 hours and they kicked him out of the gym. So extremely impressive effort at the age of 71. That record has now been overtaken by another American fellow who's up to 5,212, just out of interest. But we don't really have time to show all those shots, so I'll move on. My point of introducing you to Tom, and I'm going to come back to him a bit later, is the whole idea that skill is really technique under pressure, holding your technique under whatever pressure. So think about it, and I often think about him shooting his free throws. What happens when you get to 999? The pressure, you'd be like, oh, I better not swear, but I don't want to miss. So there'd be a lot of pressure coming on here. Same thing happens obviously in swimming, and I think the biggest form of pressure I see in swimming is when fatigue starts to take hold. How the ability to hold your stroke while under significant physical duress. And that's what we need to assess. So when we're looking at skill and we're looking at methods to train skill, are we preparing our athletes to hold their technique under pressure? And if we're not, well, we're not really meeting the needs of our athlete, and we're not really dealing with skill. We're dealing with something else altogether. We're just dealing with technique, which is only part of the equation, obviously. So I'm wondering, many of you, I suspect, might have read or seen these books, or one of these books, or both, and they're really entertaining reads on how people learn skills, essentially. And they're really based around one key theory, which is known as the theory of deliberate practice. And you might know it as the 10,000 hour rule, or it takes 10 years to become an expert. Are we familiar with that? Show of hands, maybe, would help me. Okay, so most of you are familiar with that. So the logic here, and really swimming is a classic, in a general sense, it's a classic sport for adoption of this theory, that to become highly skilled and an expert performer in whatever discipline, skill, domain you're interested in, you've got to amass some 10,000 hours. And so the theory says, well, get started early, knock up those hours so that you can be expert. And if I start before someone else, I'm going to become expert before you, etc. The issue there, and if you extrapolate that to what I see as a parent with age group swimmers, I see coaches asking my kids to swim. They go from 1, and then all of a sudden it's 3, and then it's 6 sessions a week at 11, 12 years of age. And when I wear my skill learning hat, I'm like, well, why do they need to do that much practice? It just doesn't make sense to me. So today is really me hopefully challenging you about, why do we do so much practice in swimming? Do you reckon we could do a fair bit less and still have the same impact, perhaps even a better impact? And then if we think about all the consequences of over-specialisation and overuse in terms of injury, Dave talked about the protection of young shoulders as a good example. Well, if we practice less and we practice smarter, maybe we can influence that as well. Psychological well-being of the kids, their ability to do other sports. So I get told all the time about, don't do anything other than swimming because it wrecks your stroke. Don't go and do life-saving, that really messes up your stroke. And again, my scientific hat about skill learning, it just doesn't add up. It doesn't make sense. So hopefully I'll challenge you on that today. So this theory of deliberate practice is about knocking up lots and lots of hours. But as it's been applied to sport, so this was established in 1993, looking at virtuoso violinists. As we apply it to sport over the years, the rule is now 10,000 hours plus or minus about another 6,000. So you could do 20,000 hours of practice and still not be elite. You could also get away with 3,000 or 4,000 hours and play for Australia. And it happens. There's many, many examples, research studies that have now demonstrated that. So what it's really pointing to is that the quality of the practice is the key, not the volume, not the repetitive volume. And so that's a challenge. And particularly in swimming, it's a challenge because of the nature of the way the sport is conducted. You do have high repetition. You can't change that. It's a high repetition sport. So we need to think about how we can manipulate this repetition. So a little study that we did, an observational study with some swimmers across a couple of different centres, and we really just coded their turns. We just looked at basic turn technique in terms of foot position, whether they're breathing once they get past the flags, how high their foot position is, things that we could see really easily in an observational sort of setting. And we measured the quality. And this was the quality of successful turns that they were able to do. And you know how many turns athletes do in a given week. And this is the percentage of low quality turns that they're doing within a week. And when I showed these numbers to the coaches I'm working with, no one was surprised. Everyone's like, oh yeah, that's about right. About 90% of the turns they do are crap. Why? That's your responsibility as coaches to change that. So it seems to be an accepted thing that it's okay to do junk repetition. And so straight away, if we're only getting good quality turns 10% of the time, well, there's a lot of scope here to make some positive improvement, I would have thought. And so the analogy I have is that it's like we've just got cows being milked. They just turn up, get milked, same time every day. You just come through and empty the bladder, or not the bladder, but empty the milk. Out you go again. And I know coaching's a lot more than that. And certainly when we're talking about skill, it has to be a lot more than that. And it has to be a more active process on behalf of the athlete involved. And so that's what we're going to spend a lot of time on today, is how do we practice so that we do get value out of it. Not all practice is the same. We can get far more value out of any given repetition, and that's what we're going to focus on. One of the things which I haven't got really a lot of time to touch on, but in brief terms, we know that the best athletes are the most self-regulated. And without going into this is a separate lecture really, but they plan, they evaluate, they reset their goals based on the process of what they've just done. So they think about what they're up to and where their gaps are, where their deficiencies are. They take ownership of their development. They're not passive in this process. And this starts to occur from about 12 years of age onwards. You have the capacity to be very self-regulated. And work we've done in what I consider to be a fairly similar sport to swimming in terms of volume is tennis. And the work we've done there, we can tease apart those that make the top 100 versus those that don't on the basis of their ability to self-regulate, take ownership of their development, think about their practice. But it takes a really good coach to help empower an athlete to take ownership. And so that's your role, is to develop this. And I was reading something the other week, which was about the American swimming system in the 80s. And it was a fantastic article, and it's essentially talking about that excellence is really mundane. And so we've got Madam Butterfly down the bottom here making the quote that people don't really know how ordinary success is. And there's a whole little snippet about her approach to practice. And it just demonstrated that even at the age of 13, she had developed self-regulatory skill. So she identified that she needed to get to training on time. So she wasn't apparently very good at turning up on time. So she really started demanding that, Mum, you've got to get me straight from school and I've got to get there on time. That became a real big shift in her mentality. And then the other thing she did is she focused on her turns, and she did every turn as technically correct and officially correct as possible. No one-hand touch, none of that stuff, always doing a correct turn. And she attributes that to being a really significant part of her sort of development from there and improvement that she then obviously went on and achieved. So self-regulation, really important. So for any given practice you do, if you're self-regulated, you're going to get more value straight away, let alone what you prescribe as a coach to that athlete. So briefly, we need a philosophy for this type of stuff to occur. And the philosophy that we recommend to the coaches that we work with is what's in simple terms called a constraints model. And it's really quite simple. You've got the task, you've got the environment, and you've got the person. You change any one of those three factors or constraints, and you're going to change the way the skill is performed. And so essentially, your role is very different to maybe a traditional coaching role if you take this on literally and you manipulate constraints. And I'll give you many examples of how you might do that within a swimming context in a moment. So from a coaching point of view, your job becomes one of manipulating these constraints to get a particular change in the way the skill's performed. You're really trying to do it in such a way that the athlete thinks they're the one driving the practice, not you. So they're the one generating the change. So you're allowing them to learn by themselves. So you're shaping and guiding what they do. And you're far more hands-off, questioning in how they're developing their skill as opposed to telling and directing. So it's quite a different shift in that respect to how some coach. So this all packages up together. So I've got an example here from the sport of golf about how this is an environmental constraint. So literally the environment you're in will shape the technical look of your skill. And so while you're watching this, and this is obviously meant to be a little humorous for you, what I want you to think about is think about the pool your athletes swim in. Is it a deep pool? Is it a shallow pool? That's an environmental constraint, particularly when we listen and think about turbulence in the pool, where they can dive from for a start, etc., etc. So. Oh, we've got no sound. Any sound? Doesn't matter. It's almost going in slow motion. I think I might move on. Yeah, right. I'll move on. It's quite funny, believe me. So you saw his swing. Well, what it was, the way he had to practice that swing, he's got a very small apartment, and so he's practicing in the doorway of like the sliding doors that we have here. That's how he's practicing. So that physical constraint of the doorway, which is where he takes all his practice swings, that's what you get. So that's the video. We'll move on. You guys know constraints. I just put a couple on the board. So you use lots of different devices to emphasize different things. So if we put hand paddles on, we change the way the catch is performed or the amount of force we generate or the feel we generate. You don't have to say anything. You literally just put them on and it will change the way the skill is performed. And this is what we mean by constraints. The nature of the pool that you're in will influence things. Putting a bottle on your head influences how you have to have your head in the water. These are all constraints. We're doing a lot of work where we use textured mats to emphasize the feel that the athletes, when they put their feet on the wall, it gives them haptic feedback about where their feet are. That's a constraint. It's just emphasizing foot position or the feel of application of force off the wall. So you guys use these all the time. Good coaches use them in a very methodical way to generate a particular change in the skills behavior. And the key point is, you don't necessarily need to be telling the athlete. Let them tell you. Let them understand why you're using these different tools to enhance their skill performance. So that's the philosophy. We take this hands-off approach where we manipulate constraints. We then need to manipulate the actual practice that we do.